Some stories begin with power, wealth, and charm, but this one begins with a man who had everything, until he met the one person who made him question who he truly was. From the outside, the millionaire's life appeared flawless. Luxury cars lined up in his private garage, high-rise penthouses in multiple cities, and a reputation that made both businessmen and socialites bend in his favor. He was the kind of man who entered a room and effortlessly drew every gaze, not because of humility or grace, but because people were conditioned to adore him. Money had sculpted the world around him, giving him instant access to anything he desired. Success followed him like a shadow, and he had grown accustomed to believing that nothing was beyond his reach. In his mind, wealth wasn't just an asset, it was the very definition of who he was. His reputation as a womanizer didn't bother him. In fact, he wore it almost like a badge of honor. Each new romance, each glamorous companion on his arm, fed a part of him that craved attention and validation. He never stayed long enough to hear someone's dreams, fears, or heartaches. Emotions were complications he had no patience for. Instead, he perfected the art of leaving before dawn, ensuring no one ever got close enough to understand the man behind the polished smile. His confidence was legendary, but beneath it lay a strange emptiness he had never dared to confront. To him, superficial affection was safer than something real. Growing up as the son of a powerful businessman, he had watched his father exert influence with ease. Deals were closed with handshakes over expensive cigars, and respect was purchased with silent nods and heavy wallets. The millionaire inherited this world view, absorbing the belief that dominance equaled success. Relationships had no place in a life fueled by ambition. Vulnerability was just an obstacle on the road to control. He modeled himself after the men he admired: cold, strategic, composed, and in command of every situation. Over time, he built a persona so unshakable that even he forgot there was a person beneath it. His circle of friends admired his fearlessness. They envied how he lived without apology, indulging in everything life offered. Parties at his mansion became legendary, whispered about in social circles as evenings where reality blurred and excess became the norm. He was the center of it all, the effortless charmer, the magnetic force that kept the night alive. Yet, when the music stopped and the lights dimmed, he was always alone, trapped in the quiet that followed his grand performances. But he refused to acknowledge the loneliness. He drowned it instead in noise, fame, and fleeting flattery. Every decision he made was calculated to maintain this image of power. He surrounded himself with people who mirrored his beliefs, those who viewed emotions as weaknesses and intimacy as traps. His relationships, whether business or romantic, stayed strictly transactional. Loyalty was bought, affection was rented, and trust was something he had never truly experienced. This emotional detachment became so deeply rooted in him that he began to see it as the natural order of life. To him, caring meant losing control, and losing control was unacceptable. So he kept his heart guarded, covered with layers of arrogance, confidence, and distraction. But beneath all of this, whether he admitted it or not, lingered a quiet truth. His life, though glamorous, lacked meaning. He had mastered power but never understood connection. He had conquered desires but never experienced fulfillment. While the world admired him, he secretly feared that if he ever stopped running, the emptiness would catch up to him. And so he continued, day after day, playing the role of the untouchable millionaire who needed nothing and no one. Little did he know, everything he thought defined him would soon be challenged by someone who didn't care about his reputation or wealth at all. Continuing next key points when you request. The first time he saw her, the moment was so ordinary that it almost felt accidental. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes, nor was she surrounded by admirers the way women in his world usually were. She stood quietly beside her father, holding a small notebook as if she had just come from a class or an errand. There was nothing loud about her presence, no flashy jewelry, no seductive posture, no attempt to attract attention. And yet, her simplicity struck him harder than any glamorous woman ever had. She radiated a kind of softness that made the noise around him blur. For a moment, he felt strangely still. He had expected a typical introduction, another woman impressed by his reputation, another polite smile masking excitement, another pair of eyes that followed him with unspoken expectations. But she didn't react that way. When her father mentioned his name, she simply nodded, offering a small, shy smile. Not the kind of smile meant to charm him, just a gesture of polite acknowledgement. She didn't gush over his accomplishments. She didn't seem fascinated by the wealth he carried like a crown. In fact, she looked at him the way one would look at a stranger in a crowded room, without judgment, without fear, and without the slightest trace of admiration he was used to. Her innocence didn't come from naivety, but from a quiet confidence that didn't rely on attention or approval. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply being herself, and that confused him. He wasn't used to interacting with women who didn't adjust their personalities to fit his expectations. Her genuine nature unsettled him more than any bold flirtation ever had. As she spoke softly with her father, he found himself observing her with an unfamiliar curiosity. The way she listened attentively, the kindness in her tone, the gentle patience in her expressions, these were traits alien to his fast-paced, self-indulgent world. When she finally turned to him and asked him a question, a simple, innocent question about his work, he felt his usual charm falter. He had perfected the art of speaking smoothly, effortlessly, seductively, but her sincerity pressed him into something more real. He stumbled for a moment, offering an answer that felt uncharacteristically honest. She listened without trying to impress him, without leaning closer, without playing games. Her attention wasn't flirtation, it was genuine interest, and that made him feel exposed in a way he hadn't felt before. For the first time, he wondered if the persona he lived behind might not be enough. He tried to regain control of the situation, flashing the confident smile that usually worked like magic, but she didn't react the way he expected. She didn't blush. She didn't look away in flustered excitement. Instead, she simply returned a calm, almost amused glance, as if she saw through the charm he was trying to use. It was the first time in years that someone had looked at him without being enchanted, intimidated, or overwhelmed. Instead, she saw him as just a man, not a millionaire, not a womanizer, not a legend whispered about in elite gatherings. The realization hit him unexpectedly. She was untouched by his world, and therefore, she was unshakable by the games he played. As their brief meeting ended, he found himself unusually unsettled. She walked away with her father, unaware of the impact she had just made. She did not look back, did not linger, did not try to leave an impression. And yet she had left one, a profound one. Her innocence, her calmness, her effortless authenticity, all of it clashed violently with his world of glitter and manipulation. He remained standing there, unable to shake the quiet feeling she stirred inside him. It wasn't desire, not yet. It was something deeper, something unnerving, the sudden sense that she had disrupted the balance of his carefully controlled life without even trying. Ready for key point 3 when you are. In the days that followed their first meeting, he found himself unusually distracted. He tried convincing himself that she was just another face, another fleeting impression in the endless stream of people who came and went in his extravagant life. But whenever he let his guard down in his office late at night, or while driving through silent streets, her calm eyes and quiet smile returned to him like an echo. It bothered him. He had always been the one who controlled his emotions, not the other way around. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had slipped out of his grasp the moment she had looked at him without fear or fascination. He tried to bury the feeling by throwing himself back into his usual routines. Parties, late-night gatherings, flirtations, all the noise and chaos he used to find comfort in. But he realized something unsettling. None of it worked. The laughter felt hollow, the compliments felt rehearsed, and the faces around him felt painfully predictable. He couldn't understand why. He had lived this way for years, thriving in the superficial glow of attention and desire. Yet suddenly, everything he once indulged in felt like a desperate attempt to drown out a quiet voice inside him, a voice that whispered her name more gently than he cared to admit. Whenever he thought of her, he remembered the way she listened without judgment, the way she existed without being consumed by the frantic world of wealth he had built around himself. Her presence had stirred something foreign within him, vulnerability. It frustrated him, angered him even. He had always prided himself on his emotional armor, the impenetrable walls that protected him from anything real or complicated. But her innocence had slipped through those walls effortlessly, reminding him of a softness he had long forgotten existed. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a crack in his armor, and that alone was enough to terrify him. He began questioning himself in ways he never had before. Why did he care what she thought of him? Why did her calm voice silence the noise in his mind? Why did he feel a strange sense of unease whenever he remembered how unaffected she had been by his charm? These questions haunted him, poking at the core of his identity. He wasn't used to doubt. He wasn't used to wanting someone's approval without knowing why. And the more he tried to force these thoughts away, the stronger they returned, like waves breaking against the shore of his carefully constructed confidence. His frustration only grew when he saw her again, this time by accident, at a gathering hosted by his father. She was helping in the kitchen, laughing softly with the house staff, treating everyone around her with kindness and dignity. While other guests floated around in designer gowns and expensive jewelry, she stood there effortlessly radiant, untouched by the superficiality around her. When she looked up and noticed him, she offered a polite smile, nothing more. No attempt to impress, no hidden intentions, just that same sincere expression that made him feel disarmed. In that moment, he realized the truth. She didn't fit into his world, but part of him desperately wished she could. This inner conflict consumed him. For the first time in his life, he felt torn between who he had always been and who he could be. He wanted to approach her, yet something held him back, a fear he couldn't name. The fear of being seen, really seen, the fear that if she looked closely enough, she would discover the emptiness behind his charming exterior. And yet, he also feared the opposite, that she might not see him at all, that she might continue viewing him as nothing more than a man shaped by wealth and reputation. In this quiet war between control and vulnerability, he realized something profound. She was the first person who made him want to be more than the persona he had crafted. She made him want to be real. The more time he spent around her, even indirectly, the more he began noticing the stark contrast between her world and his. She navigated life with a quiet grace, interacting with people from all walks of life with the same gentle sincerity. Whether she was speaking to a maid, a driver, or a family friend, her tone never changed. She treated everyone with a respect he had never witnessed so consistently. It was humbling in a way he could not understand. Watching her made him aware of how often he had relied on status, wealth, and influence to communicate. Her kindness exposed the sharp edges of his personality and reflected parts of himself he had long ignored. He began observing her in moments she didn't notice, not out of obsession, but out of silent curiosity. When she spoke, she chose her words thoughtfully, never raising her voice, never trying to dominate a conversation. When she listened, she offered her full attention, making people feel heard in a way he had never done. Her innocence wasn't childish, it was compassionate. It wasn't weakness, it was strength. And in her presence, he felt the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. For the first time, he began to see how detached he had become from real human connection. As days passed, her presence highlighted the emptiness of his lifestyle more clearly than anything else ever had. The parties he once lived for suddenly felt loud and meaningless. The flirtatious glances that used to boost his ego now felt shallow. Even the compliments he received once for his confidence began sounding like rehearsed lines spoken by people who cared more about his wealth than his soul. Every time he found himself drifting back into his old ways, the memory of her calm, sincere expression pulled him back, reminding him of what authenticity looked like. He noticed changes in himself, small at first, but undeniable. He became quieter in conversations, less eager to dominate. He found himself thinking before speaking, considering how his words might affect others. Even his interactions with women changed. The charm he once wore like armor began to feel unnecessary, even dishonest. He didn't want to impress anyone anymore. He didn't want validation or temporary affection. What he wanted was something real, something meaningful, something he didn't even know he was yearning for until she reflected the truth back at him through her gentle eyes. Yet these changes weren't easy for him to accept. They challenged everything he believed he was. He had always thought emotional detachment was strength, that caring too deeply was a flaw. But her innocence made him realize how wrong he had been. She made vulnerability seem beautiful, not dangerous. She made kindness look powerful, not naive. And through her, he began to understand that the strongest people weren't the ones who felt nothing, they were the ones who allowed themselves to feel, even when it scared them. But perhaps the most unsettling revelation came when he acknowledged that she saw him differently from everyone else, not as a millionaire, not as a charming figure, not as a man with a long list of conquests. She saw him simply as a person, and that simplicity shook him to the core. She mirrored the version of himself he had forgotten, existed the version untouched by ego, pride, or fear. Through her innocence, he faced the harsh truth. He had spent years running from his own emptiness, hiding behind wealth and reputation. And now, with one sincere glance, she made him see himself clearly for the first time. Not as a legend, not as a player, but as a man who desperately needed change. Change never happens suddenly. It begins with small, almost invisible shifts that slowly reshape a person from the inside out. And for him, that transformation began quietly. At first, he didn't even realize what was happening. He just found himself thinking twice before making the kinds of choices he once made effortlessly. Parties he used to attend without hesitation suddenly felt like obligations. Flirtations that once thrilled him now felt pointless, even draining. It wasn't that he lacked the ability to charm anymore. He simply didn't feel the need to. Something in his heart had started awakening, softening, questioning. Something he hadn't invited, yet couldn't resist. He didn't decide to change because he was trying to win her affection or admiration. He barely spoke to her, and she certainly didn't guide his actions. Instead, her influence worked quietly, like sunlight slowly brightening a dim room. The more he reflected on her gentle strength, the more he became aware of the man he had become. A man driven by ego, not purpose. A man who collected attention but lacked connection. A man who lived loudly but felt nothing deeply. Her presence illuminated the parts of himself he had ignored for years, and he began craving something he had never sought before: sincerity. Gradually, he started making conscious choices, ones that surprised even him. He apologized when he was rude, something he had never done before. He listened more during conversations, valuing what others said instead of looking for a chance to display his own superiority. He even began treating his staff with a respect that felt strange at first, but soon felt natural. The walls around his heart, built from arrogance, guarded by pride, began to crack. And in those cracks, a gentler version of himself started to emerge. Not perfect, not polished, but real. His closest friends noticed the shift before he did. They questioned him, teased him, even warned him that he was losing his edge. But he no longer cared about maintaining an image of invulnerable masculinity or playboy confidence. Those things suddenly felt childish, exhausting. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace in simply being himself. Not the image he had crafted for the world, but the person he had buried beneath years of bad habits. Her influence didn't change his personality, it awakened the values he had abandoned long ago. One of the biggest moments of transformation came unexpectedly. He found himself standing in front of a mirror one evening, staring at his reflection, the sharp suit, the expensive watch, the perfectly styled hair, and feeling an unfamiliar discomfort. None of it felt like him anymore. The reflection looked like a stranger wearing a mask he no longer wanted. In that moment, he realized how much of his life had been dedicated to impressing people who didn't matter, achieving things that didn't fulfill him, and chasing pleasures that left him emptier each time. Her innocence had cracked something open inside him, and now he couldn't unsee the truth. He began seeking out moments of stillness, something he never allowed himself before. He spent more time with his father, had genuine conversations with employees he once overlooked, and even found himself helping her father with small tasks at family gatherings. He didn't do these things for attention. He did them because they felt right, because they made him feel grounded, because they made him feel human. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the truth. She hadn't just inspired change, she had awakened a version of him he never believed he could become. A version capable of honesty, humility, kindness, and maybe someday, love. There comes a moment in every person's life when the mask they've worn for years begins to feel too heavy to hold. For him, that moment arrived quietly, without drama, without grand gestures, just a simple interaction that shifted everything. He had been avoiding his feelings, pretending the changes within him were temporary or insignificant. Yet the truth settled deeper each day, becoming impossible to ignore. The realization struck him one afternoon when he saw her sitting alone on the balcony of his father's home, sketching something in her notebook with a peaceful focus that seemed worlds away from the chaos of his life. He stood there watching her, and for the first time in his life he felt powerless, but strangely at peace with it. As he approached her, he felt something he couldn't remember ever experiencing before: nervousness. His heart beat too loudly. His usually steady confidence wavered, and for a moment he considered turning around. But she looked up at him with that same gentle sincerity he had come to recognize, and his entire facade crumbled. He tried speaking as he always did, with charm and humor, but the words felt forced. She tilted her head, noticing his discomfort, and asked softly if he was all right. It was such a simple question, ordinary, almost meaningless, yet it cut deeper than any sharp criticism could. No one had ever asked him that without expecting something in return, and in that moment he realized how deeply he craved honesty. He sat beside her, trying to steady his breathing, and for the first time in years he allowed silence to exist without trying to fill it. She didn't rush him, didn't pry, didn't attempt to read his thoughts. She simply waited. Her patience unnerved him, but it also soothed him in a way he didn't understand. Eventually, without planning to, he confessed something small: a worry, a fear, a fragment of his truth. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, but it was real, and she listened, truly listened, without judgment or surprise. In her calm acceptance, he felt something inside him break open. The walls he had built his entire life began to crumble, piece by piece, and he didn't try to stop it. The loss of control should have terrified him. He had spent years mastering the art of emotional distance, keeping everyone at arm's length, ensuring no one had the power to hurt him. But with her, vulnerability didn't feel like danger, it felt like relief. He found himself admitting things he had never spoken aloud, thoughts he had buried under luxury and arrogance. And the most shocking part was that she didn't treat him any differently afterward. She didn't pity him or pedestal him. She didn't act impressed or overwhelmed. She simply smiled, as though seeing the real him was the easiest thing in the world. In that moment, he understood something profound. Losing control wasn't the same as losing himself. In fact, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally finding himself. He realized how much energy he had wasted pretending to be invincible, and how liberating it felt to simply be human in front of someone he trusted. Her innocence had softened him, but it had also strengthened him. She hadn't made him weaker, she had made him honest. and honesty required more courage than any charm or power he had ever displayed. As they sat there together, the world around them fading into quiet, he felt a truth settle into his heart with stunning clarity. She was the first person who had ever reached the part of him he had spent years hiding. The part that longed for connection, understanding, and peace. And he accepted, fully and without hesitation, that he had lost control the moment she entered his life. But instead of fighting it, he embraced it. Because losing control wasn't the end of him, it was the beginning of something he had never allowed himself to believe in. Something real, something human, something that had the power to change everything. As time passed, he realized that life was never meant to be a series of conquests, transactions, or hollow victories. The woman he once thought would be just another passing moment had transformed him in ways money, power, and charm never could. In her innocence, he found clarity. In her kindness, he discovered strength. And in her presence, he finally understood what it meant to feel not superficially, but deeply, truly, and without fear. He had lost control, yes, but in doing so, he had gained something far greater, himself. For the first time, he wasn't defined by wealth, reputation, or ego. He was defined by honesty, by courage, and by the capacity to love in a way that was real and unguarded. And as he looked at her, the one who had opened his heart and reflected his better self, he realized that some people don't just enter your life. They awaken it.